Welcome back to the course on knowing and believing. And we started off this course last week by learning about lying, which I found absolutely fascinating. And today we're going to be focusing on the good and evil as found in the biblical tale of Adam and Eve. Our speaker today is Dr. Robert Kawashima. He teaches in UF's Department of Religion and the Center for Jewish Studies. He undertook graduate studies at the University of California, Berkeley, earning a Ph.D. in comparative literature there in 2001. He's written extensively on the Hebrew Bible, as well as ancient mythology, Homer, and narrative theory. His second book, The Archaeology of Ancient Israelite Knowledge, was just published earlier this month by Indiana University Press. Dr. Kawashima, go ahead.
Hi, so I'm sorry I'm not there in person. I would much prefer to teach in person and have access to a chalkboard. That's how I tend to operate. I was asked to, I was warned that I should speak slowly. I have the tendency of speaking very quickly, so I'm hoping the camera will turn around on the room. And I also have the chat thing opened on the right of the screen. So if I start speaking too quickly, I hope somebody will interrupt me and tell me to slow down, because I'm going to try, but it's my habit is just to start speaking faster and faster. So, you know, I was told that the topic was knowing and believing. So I thought the easiest thing for me would be to talk about the story of the Garden of Eden, and in particular, the idea of the knowledge of good and evil. I teach this story pretty much every year, every academic year. And I make it a point of trying to dispel what I think are the misreadings of this story. So I'll just put it out there, and maybe some of you will be shocked, but just keep an open mind, suspend disbelief, and try to hear what I'm going to tell you about today. So this story is not what you've been told. It is not about original sin. It is not about the fall of man. And it doesn't tell us how Eve is the source of sin in the world. So you have to think about this story as an allegory for the human condition. What does it mean to be human? In a sense, the story poses the question, what is life like for a human being in this world? That's the starting point. And the answer, which everybody knows, because we all live in the world as human beings, is life is difficult. It's almost as if God has cursed us. So, which you'll recognize is the end of the story. So the other thing to think about is, as an allegory for the human condition, the story isn't exactly about Adam and Eve as two individual characters that we should think of as individuals. They are emblems, allegorical figures of the human condition. And in fact, the story doesn't contain, we're in the habit of referring to them as Adam and Eve. And I often refer to them as Adam and Eve as well, just as a kind of shortcut. But if you read Genesis 2-3, you'll discover that there are no proper nouns in the story. Eve is only referred to as Eve at the very end, as they're getting kicked out of the garden. Adam in the story is never referred to as Adam with a capital A. The Hebrew is Ha-Adam, which means simply the Adam or the human. So he is actually, so throughout the story, they're simply referred to as the human, Ha-Adam, and his wife or his woman. so they don't have names. In a sense, then the story is just about this human couple, the woman. And so in that sense, they symbolize, they're not so much individuals, they're just a symbol of what it means to be human. The other thing that I would point out is, so they're not exactly the parents of all of humanity. If you take a look at, so you have the handout, you can start looking at the handout.
I'll share it now.
Yeah, the story of the Garden of Eden is sort of this separate little thing. It's a kind of individual story. And then they are in this garden, and as soon as Cain leaves the garden, you'll note, maybe you've wondered, why is it that there are other human beings in the world? Or where did his wife come from? So Genesis chapter 4, Cain said, "My punishment is greater than I can bear. You have driven me away from the soil. I shall be a fugitive and a wanderer on the earth. And anyone who meets me may kill me." Who is he going to meet? He's supposedly the only person in the world, along with his brother, soon to be killed, and his two parents. And then a couple verses later, Cain knew his wife, and she conceived and bore Enoch. So the writer is quite aware that he's not talking about the first human couple that come to populate the entire world. That they're a symbol of the world, of what it means to be human on the side, and then in a sense they're disjointed from the subsequent story. When Cain goes out into the world, there's already a world waiting for him, a world populated with people, a wife, a woman who he will marry and with whom he will have children, and so forth. On the other hand, the writer does want us to think that Noah, after the flood, is the father of all of humankind. So that's why I included Genesis chapter 9. The sons of Noah were Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Ham was the father of Canaan. These three were the sons of Noah, and from these the whole world was peopled. So the writer is quite aware that Adam and Eve, in his mind, were not the parents of all humankind. Noah, on the other hand, was, right? Okay, so maybe I will back up for a second. Maybe some of you are wondering why I'm starting with Genesis chapter 2 and not Genesis chapter 1. So as it turns out, I can't see any human beings, which is a little odd. So I'm trying to change how this works. Okay. As it turns out, Genesis chapter 1 is a separate story from Genesis chapter 2 and 3, which is why I'm starting with chapter 2 and I'm ignoring chapter 1. They are actually written by two different authors, writing in two different times and places. Maybe you'll recall that in chapter 1, on the sixth day of the world, God creates humans. He creates them last, after the fish and the birds, after the land animals. Then he creates human beings, male and female, and he creates male and female simultaneously. In chapter 2, what happens? God creates first Adam, and then he creates all the other animals. And then last but not least, he creates the woman, Eve, right? So you'll note that chapter 1 and chapter 2 are mutually incompatible. You can't reconcile the two stories with each other. So as strange as it seems, we're going to focus on the Garden of Eden and we're going to ignore chapter 1. So I'm not going to take into account anything that you've read in the previous chapter, okay? So back to this idea that the story is an allegory. I'm going to use another fancy word. It's an etiology. For my young students, I would call it an origin story, because if you've ever, maybe your children or grandchildren read comic books, there will be an origin story about how Superman came to be, or about how Spider-Man came to be. This is a story about how it is that we come to live in a world where life is difficult, as I've said, where we seem to be cursed. So in a sense, you have to read the story backwards. Most stories, you start with some characters, you have a time and a place, a setting, and then the point of the story is to discover how you get from here to the conclusion, how you get from here to there. It's called a plot, and the plot is unpredictable. You have no idea where we're going to end up at the end of the story. With this story, the end of the story is a foregone conclusion. All human beings know what life is like. It's difficult, and then we die, right? And so the story is, as you read the story, you have to think of the conclusion as fated. It's necessary. I think people tend to read the story and think to themselves, no, don't do it. Don't eat the fruit. You'll regret it. It's a big mistake. But in fact, that's the wrong way to read the story. We're fated to eat the fruit of the knowledge of good and evil. We are fated to become cursed, to live outside of the garden in the real world. And so none of it is avoidable. And for reasons that I'll try to explain, we were never meant to remain in the garden. According to this misreading where the garden is paradise, it's the ideal life, there's a sense where we should have remained there, and it's somehow a tragic error that we disobeyed God, got kicked out of the garden, and live a life of pain and suffering followed by death. But in fact, it's the other way around. We all know what it means to be human. We were never meant to remain in the garden. And for various reasons, it's a good thing that we're not in the garden, if you stop to think about it. Why were we fated to be cursed? Why is the human condition such as it is? Why is life difficult? It's because we have knowledge. Knowledge is not a bad thing. It's not evil. And acquiring this knowledge was not a sin against God. And it's not the original sin. And it doesn't lead to the fall of humankind. The reason why humans lead this life of pain and suffering, the reason why we have knowledge, unlike the other animals, it's precisely because we have this innate desire to know, to have knowledge. Knowledge is not a good thing. It makes us fully human. In particular, it makes us like God. So I'm going to break the rules. I have the chat open up. Before I continue, are there any questions? I would like you to feel free to interrupt me in case something that I've said is unclear, or maybe there's a glitch in technology, something got garbled, or maybe I'm speaking a little too fast. So perhaps I'll give you a chance to ask questions.
Okay, the audience here at OComic, are there any questions? Okay, online, anybody want to raise their hand? I think we're okay right now, Dr. Kawashima.
Okay. So back to the handout. Let's look at Genesis chapter 2. In the day that the Lord God made the earth and the heavens, when no plant of the field was yet in the earth, and the vegetation of the field had not yet sprung up, for the Lord God had not caused it to rain upon the earth, and there was no one to till the ground, but a stream would rise up from the earth and water the whole face of the ground. Then the Lord God formed man from the dust of the ground and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and the man became a living being. And the Lord God planted a garden in Eden in the east. There he put the man whom he had formed. And out of the ground, the Lord God made to grow every tree that is pleasant to the sight and good for food, the tree of life also in the midst of the garden, and the tree of knowledge of good and evil. So what the story sets up is you have to think of this as a division between two different spaces. There's the field outside, where there is no rain, no plants, and no one to work the field. You could think of this as wild nature. It's the place, or it's also less hospitable, it's less ideal than a garden, right? It's the place where we will end up at the end of the story, where we will be the people who till the ground, who plant vegetables so that we can survive, and who will depend on rain so that our it's called agriculture. We need rain in order for us to grow food to eat. The garden, in contrast, if you think about what a garden is, it's natural, right? It's outdoors, but it's not wild. It's domesticated. It's a man-made space. Typically, there are boundaries or borders to demarcate the garden from the rest of the field, so that wild nature has weeds and so forth. And the garden is this thing where people plant what they want and they weed diligently so that the weeds don't choke out what they want to grow. In this case, it's a fruit orchard, right? God creates this enclosed space and plants all of these fruit trees, and that's where the human is placed, right? There is also a spring, so that you don't have to worry about rain. The spring waters the whole garden, the whole face of the earth. So the garden then is a kind of, think of it as a kind of luxury in the ancient world. If you were to look up the word garden in the entire Bible, there are very few people who are named who actually have a garden. And in fact, and these are all kings. In 1st and 2nd Kings, there are a few men who are said to have a garden attached to their home. They are kings, and therefore they have the luxury of having a backyard, a private backyard, where they can grow things like fruits and vegetables. And so while the story never mentions it, the very notion of a garden full of fruit trees implies the presence of a house. So in that sense, Adam and Eve actually live in God's backyard, his fruit orchard. And God himself lives in a house attached to the garden. And during, as we know later in the story, in the heat of the afternoon, he will sometimes walk out into the backyard, walk around his fruit trees, and enjoy the shade and the cool breeze, right? So the field is a wild nature. The garden is a domesticated nature, okay? So think about what life in the garden is like. It summons up a kind of ideal life, but the ideal life comes at a cost. So note how easy life is for Adam and Eve at the beginning of the story. They live in a fruit orchard that they didn't have to plant. God did all the work, right? They don't have to, God tells them to watch over the garden. So he gives them a sort of minimal task, but there are no predators, there are no enemies, there's no danger. So their so-called job, if you want to call it that, the work that God gives them is really quite simple. They just watch over the garden, right? They don't have to plant it, and they don't have to water it, they don't have to weed it. And therefore, if they get, when they get hungry, what do they have to do? There's no work involved. They simply reach out, grab a piece of fruit, and eat. They eat fruit raw. So this is what anthropologists would think of as a kind of hunter-gathering society, right? Before agriculture. Except here they're vegetarians. They only eat, or they're fruitarians, whatever. They only eat fruit in its raw state. There are no predators. They all get along with the animals. We'll talk about that more in a few minutes. So it's a kind of gathering society where they don't have to practice agriculture. Agriculture, by contrast to life in the garden, takes hard work, right? And in fact, the very name Eden is related to another Hebrew word, edna, which means pleasure. So there is the sense where life in the garden is ideal, peaceful, pleasurable, right? It's a kind of paradise. But let's step back and think more about what Adam and Eve are in this story. People think that, again, this misreading, we were supposed to remain in the garden. We had this special relationship with God and so forth, right? But actually, Adam and Eve are naked. And I told you that the garden in the Bible implies that it's the backyard to a house. God lives inside the house. Adam and Eve live outside the house, in the backyard, naked, where they are told to watch over the garden, right? So what does that make Adam and Eve? They're something like God's pets, right? We're not children of God. We're not inside the house hanging out with God. We're in the backyard naked, right? We are, more precisely, we could say we're like God's guard dogs, right? They have this special place in the garden, namely, they guard over the garden from other people, let's say. But in this case, there are no other animals or people that would threaten the garden. We all get along. Right? So this so-called ideal paradisiacal life in the garden is not entirely ideal because we're not yet human beings. We're not yet like God. So the relationship between Adam and Eve and God is not one of a beloved father and his children, these human beings that he loves and cherishes. It's more like a master and his pets, right? So this is in contrast to later in the story where, human beings will have a relationship with God, where God will later in the Bible, Israel will be thought of as God's chosen people. God will make a covenant with various human beings. So this covenant is, by contrast to Adam and Eve, a kind of proper relationship. It's a relationship between adult parties, right? Where there is no real relationship between God and Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden. It's just one of a master and his pets, right? So the story of the Garden of Eden is about two transformations. It's the transformations that will change us from being God's pets, God's guard dogs, into being fully human beings, to having that thing that I called at the beginning of the lecture, the human condition, right? It's the human condition is difficult, but that's what it means to be a grown-up, in a sense, to live in the quote-unquote real world, right? So the first transformation is that moment when Eve, not as the person who introduces sin into the world, but in a sense, she's the culture hero. She's the one who reaches out, grabs the fruit of the tree of knowledge, and eats first, and then gives it to her husband second. And so she's the one that introduces culture into the world. This is the moment when Eve and then Adam become, quote, like God, knowing good and evil. The second transformation is when Adam and Eve are expelled from the garden. We'll get to that. I've already suggested that the garden is this domesticated space. It's a world where life is easy. But as we know, life is difficult. So the moment when we get expelled from the garden is the moment when we become fully human beings who are left to survive on our own in the real world, right? And in fact, so you have to think about it as we live not in God's house, but the garden is part of God's, let's call it, estate, right? So as long as we're inside of the garden, inside of God's private property, his estate, we are, in a sense, his dependents. He's the one that provides us with food in the form of fruit. We're under his protection, so we're inside of his property line. Life is easy and we're protected. We're in this domesticated space as opposed to wild space out there, right? In biblical Hebrew, you could think of this as being leaving the garden. So in biblical Hebrew, to be married is a man gives something called a bride price to his future father-in-law. And in exchange for this price, the daughter leaves the house of her father and moves into the house of her husband. And then divorce, if it should take place, is the opposite movement. It says the biblical Hebrew phrase for divorce is he sends his wife out of his house, right? So the movement out of his house is when she is no longer part of the man's household, one of his dependents, under his protection, receiving food and board from the husband. She leaves the house, the protection of the husband, and presumably goes back to the father's house, right? And so in a similar way, when Adam and Eve, it says God sends them, expels them from the garden. In a sense, what he's doing is, this is the moment when, well, it's a little like when your children grow up and move out of the house and go to college. They're now 18 years old, they're legal adults, and it's like that idea of legal emancipation, that they move out of mom and dad's house, they move into the quote unquote real world, and they become grown-ups who have to live on their own. They have to now start to cook for themselves, clean for themselves, and so forth, take care of themselves as adults. And that's basically what happens when Adam and Eve are kicked out of the garden. They are, as I'll explain in a minute, they have become human beings, something like legal adults. And so therefore, they're emancipated from God's household. They are forced to live on their own, to take care, fend for themselves in the real world, and not live the life of children or pets as part of God's household, right? So if you back up and read the story of the chapters 2 and 3, there are in this story 3 categories of being. Let's take a look at chapter 2, verse 7. The Lord God formed man from the dust of the ground and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and the man became a living being. And then remember, he says, it's not good for the human to be alone. Let's make him, I can't remember what it says here. I think in the King James, it's something like a helpmeet or something, a partner, a suitable partner for the man, right? So first he goes through this experiment. So out of the ground, the Lord God formed every animal of the field and every bird of the air and brought them to the man to see what he would call them. And whatever the man called every living creature, that's the NRSV, but it's exactly the same Hebrew term as living being, nefesh chaya. Whatever the man called every living being, that was its name. So at the beginning of the story, Adam is a living being just like all the rest of the animals. In other words, we're all animals together, right? Humans are part of the animal kingdom. And at the beginning of the story, before we get the knowledge of good and evil, we're one of the animals. Remember, we're naked. We live in a garden, share the space with all the other animals. We're not distinguished by them by any particular special trait. We're just one of the animals, right? So a living being is qualified by, we lack knowledge, we have yet to eat from the tree of knowledge, and we lack immortality, right? That's Adam and Eve at the beginning of the story. No knowledge, no immortality, naked with the animals in the garden. So chapter 3, when the serpent convinces the woman to eat, but the serpent said to the woman, "You will not die, for God knows that when you eat of it, your eyes will be opened and you will be like God, knowing good and evil." It's in the Hebrew, it's difficult to know whether to translate it like God with a capital G in the singular, or you could easily translate it, you will be like gods, plural, lowercase g, knowing good and evil. So what does it mean to be like God? It means that we have knowledge. We know good and evil, but we're not immortal, right? As God says in chapter, as he implies, chapter 3, verse 22, the Lord God said, "See, the humans have become like one of us, knowing good and evil." Note the plural. It's as if there's more than one entity in the divine family. It's some strange echo of an earlier idea. The humans have become like one of us, knowing good and evil. And now they might reach out their hands and take also from the tree of life and eat and live forever. So what does that mean? It's one thing to be like God, to have knowledge, but not to be immortal. But if we were to eat the tree of life and become immortal, then we would, for all intents and purposes, be one of the gods, right? God is saying it's fine for them to have knowledge, but I'm not going to let them have knowledge and have immortality. That's unacceptable. Then he would become one of us, being both, having both knowledge and immortality. And so in order to prevent that second, that, or let's call it, them taking that second step and actually becoming divine beings, he kicks them out of the garden, right? He maintains the boundary between humans and gods. So to be like God is precisely not to be God. We're like God, but we're still not a God. The thing that distinguishes us from the animals is knowledge. We have, by eating this fruit, we have risen up above the status of the rest of the animal world. We have become like God, but we still haven't risen to that third state where we would actually be gods. That is reserved for the immortals. And it's just as much as it is the lot of human beings to live a difficult life, it is the lot of human beings to die eventually, right? We cannot live forever. We cannot be God. So, what does it mean to have this knowledge? I think the first clue is, what's the first realization that Adam and Eve have? What's the first thing they do? They are naked and ashamed, and therefore they create clothing for themselves. So note what's happened. Animals are naked and they feel no shame about it, right? So when Adam and Eve get this knowledge, they experience something called shame, which is unique to human beings. And they feel the need to cover their nakedness. So they're leaving the naked world of nature and they're entering into the clothed world of culture, where we experience shame, we cover our nakedness. We have left nature, we have become cultured beings, right? This is the difference between humans and animals. And note what they do. Nobody told them, you have to think of this fruit as being sort of magical. The Adam and Eve magically get this knowledge, and this knowledge, this is what it means to be human. This is what makes us special, separate from the animals. We have knowledge. And what does this knowledge do? Note, they experience a problem, shame, and then by their own resources, they come up with a solution. Nobody told them how to create clothes. They just, out of their own resources, their intellectual resources, they say, we're going to invent something to cover our nakedness so that we don't feel shame, embarrassment. And so they invent something called clothing, right? This is what humans are going to do for the rest of the story. They're going to invent things. And in fact, if you read on into chapter 4, we'll see other things that humans invent. They learn to work with metals. They invent things like musical instruments. There are advances in things like making tents, in animal husbandry. So there's chapter 4 goes on to talk about the things that human beings, this is the, in other words, the rise of human civilization, the continued evolution of human culture. It all begins because of Eve. For all she knows, she might die. She doesn't know, so she takes a calculated risk. God has told Adam and Eve that in the day that you eat of this fruit, you will die. But in spite of it, they feel this innate desire, this impulse to get knowledge, even at the threat of punishment. And so they risk everything. They take the fruit and they eat it. And so I think it's significant that Eve is the one that, in a sense, we complete our creation, right? God creates the human, Adam, in the state of nature. And human beings only become fully human when they disobey God and they become something more than just an animal. And so I think it's significant that Adam and Eve themselves have to take that step in order to rise above the rest of the animals and to become human beings, right? To create culture, to invent this thing that hadn't existed before. So speaking of this theme, knowing and believing, the Bible does not think that knowledge is evil. It's a misreading. The knowledge of good and evil is the thing that makes us humans, as opposed to animals. So now let's take a look at Numbers 14. So we're in the middle of the wilderness. Moses has led us out of Egypt. We're wandering around, and then God says, go into the promised land and kill off the giants. I will be with you, and then you will come to possess the land and become Israel. But the people are afraid because there are giants in the land, and so they disobey God and they disobey Moses. So God finally has had enough, and for this act of disobedience, God says, your dead bodies shall fall in this very wilderness, and of all your number included in the census from 20 years old and up, who have complained against me, not one of you shall come into the land which I swore to settle you. But your little ones who said you would become plunder for the giants, I will bring in, and they will know the land that you have despised. So what's going on? God has decided to punish the people, but only those who are 20 years old and up. So if you're a child, if you're under 20 years old, you are still a minor, as we would say. And therefore, God does not hold you accountable for your actions. And so therefore, God does not punish the children, only the adults. So there's an important distinction in the Bible between children who God doesn't hold accountable and adults, 20 years old and up. And now let's turn to Deuteronomy Chapter 1. We're starting at the same moment here. This is Moses retelling the same story. Not one of those shall see the good land that I swore to give to your ancestors. As for your little ones, who you thought would become plunder, your children who today do not know right from wrong, they shall enter there. To them I will give it. The phrase, I think it would be better to translate, it's because it's exactly the same in the Hebrew. Your children who today do not know good and evil, they shall enter there. To them I will give it. So this knowledge of good and evil is not a bad thing that drags you down and makes you a sinful being. Knowledge of good and evil means to be an adult, right? The adults should know better. The children lack this knowledge, they're ignorant, and therefore they're still children, right? So the knowledge of good and evil in biblical Hebrew means you're an adult. You are legally competent, and you are a grown-up capable of making adult decisions. And so the lack of this knowledge is actually a bad thing. Children should grow up. They should become adults. They should get knowledge of good and evil. So going back to Genesis, it was a natural thing that Adam and Eve eventually disobeyed God, got this knowledge, and grew up, right? Their little act of disobedience, I would say, is not a sin. It's in a certain way. I try to explain to my students, if you think about it, everyone at some point will finally disobey their parents. That's part of growing up. And I think if someone never disobeys their parents, it's a bad thing. And it's a sign that they're stuck in a kind of childhood, that they're perpetually immature. And so note again, that moment when Adam and Eve disobey God, their parent, if you will, their master, they become adults. And that's the same moment when they have to leave God's house and live on their own. Just like children grow up, they come to think for themselves, to disobey their parents, and they move out of their parents' house and move into the real world and live on their own as grown-ups, right? It's not a good thing to remain in your parents' house forever. This story seems to suggest, right? If you want further evidence, I probably don't have time, but I gave you a couple of other examples in 2 Samuel where there's a reference to this knowledge of good and evil. This is about King David. My Lord, the King is like an angel of God. This knowing, again, I would say, discerning good and evil. Or in verse 20, you have wisdom like the angel of God to know all things that are on the earth. So this discerning good and evil is a kind of knowledge to know all things that are on the earth. And it's a compliment. You're like an angel of God. It's not evil. It's oh, I see that there's a chat, but I'll have to respond to that later. So okay, so let's see. Let's turn to chapter 3 now, the curses. When we become humans. First, the curse to the serpent. Because you have done this, cursed are you among animals and among all the wild creatures. Upon your belly you shall go, and dust you shall eat. I will put enmity between you and the woman, between your offspring and hers. He will strike your head, and you will strike his heel. So, remember, etiology. So we know that the serpent is a strange animal. It has no legs. And so the story is telling us why it has this strange fate of eating dust and so forth. It's because it literally tricked, it talked Eve into eating this fruit. Verse 15, this enmity. I think there's a tradition where the snake becomes Satan, but 3 verse 1, it's simply one of the animals that the Lord God created, the smartest of all the animals. It's not Satan or the devil. It's the animal. The snake, in a sense, symbolizes the animal kingdom and why it's dangerous. So this, I will put enmity between you and the woman, between your offspring and hers. This is the moment. Remember, in the garden, we all lived together in peace, right? Lions, tigers, bears, poisonous snakes. We all got along in the garden, and nobody ate anybody else. The snakes didn't yet bite us and kill us with their venom. But now that as we leave the real world, this idyllic existence where where all the animals get along is dissolved. From now on, the wild kingdom of animals is a world where you eat or you are eaten. And so the snake is now our enemy. It's dangerous. And by extension, all of these wild animals are our enemy and vice versa. Recall that as Adam and Eve leave the garden, God creates leather garments for them. So he decides that the leaves aren't enough. And so, but note what's implied. An innocent animal has been killed. God skinned it and turned its skin into clothing, into leather garments. So the garment now symbolizes, it's a symbol that, we live through the death of other animals, right? There's an enmity between us and the animal world. We will eat them, we will skin them, we will use them in various ways to make our lives more comfortable. So, and it's kind of summed up in the fact that there's enmity between the serpent and between us. So therefore, in Isaiah, when he wants to think of this ideal world in the future, he imagines an ideal future where all the animals get along with each other again. The wolf shall live with the lamb, the cow and the bear shall graze, the nursing child shall play over the hole of the asp. So remember, we're going back to that venomous serpent, right? In an ideal future, our children will be able to play with these serpents and they'll be okay, right? Genesis 3, verse 16, the curse to the woman. I will make your pangs and childbirth exceedingly great. In pain you shall bring forth children. Your desire shall be for your husband, and he shall rule over you. So note, in the garden, there's a sense where there's a kind of, I don't think it was ever, let's say, the ancient world was sexist. Adam was created first. That's not coincidence. But there's some sort of harmony between Adam and Eve, let's say, in the garden, right? This is the one, bone of my bone, flesh of my flesh. There's that sense of he found his other half, as it were, right? A perfect companion. But in the real world, marriage is not this idyllic thing. There's this kind of, your desire will be for him and he shall rule over you. So there's this, in the real world, there's a struggle in marriage between man and woman. And then the fact that she gives that childbirth is painful and in fact dangerous, right? There are women who will die in childbirth in the rest of the book of Genesis. And if you think about animals, they tend to, we see the animal kingdom as being fecund. They drop their young, they give birth to litters, to several offspring at the same time. Whereas in the book of Genesis, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, they will have difficulty conceiving even a single son. So this is the sense of humans. The human body is a weak and frail thing compared to the animals, right? The animals are fruitful and multiply, but human beings are much weakened in the real world. So for instance, in Exodus 1, verse 19, the midwives lie to Pharaoh and they appeal to what they think is his racism. The Hebrew women are not like the Egyptian women. They are, quote, vigorous, but the Hebrew can also be construed as they're kind of like animals. They just drop their young. They don't need us midwives the way civilized Egyptian women do, right? So I think it points to this idea in biblical Hebrew where the animals naturally give birth, but human beings have frail, weak bodies. So this is part of the problem of being a human. We have knowledge, but we've lost our natural power. We've lost the kind of the potency of wild animals. Our bodies are much more frail. We need clothing. We need to live in shelters and so forth, right? And finally, the curse to the man. Because you have listened to the voice of your wife, cursed is the ground because of you. In toil you shall eat of it all the days of your life. Thorns and thistles it shall bring forth for you, and you shall eat the plants of the field. By the sweat of your face you shall eat bread until you return to the ground, for out of it you were taken. You are dust, and to dust you shall return. So this is, note, this is again that distinction between culture and nature. In the state of nature, we ate raw food, fruit. So this is, and fruit of trees that we didn't have to plant. So nature gives us food in its natural state. We don't have to plant anything, we don't have to work anything. We eat raw things. Now we're eating plants of the field, not fruit, but plants that we have to plant. Remember, the field didn't have rain. There was no one to till the ground. There were no plants. So now there's somebody, we're going to have to till the ground. We're going to have to plant food so that we can survive, and we're going to depend on rain. And so this is agriculture. Our diet has changed from something that nature gives us in the raw state to we have to create our own food through agriculture, and we don't eat wheat or grain raw. We have to process it, turn it into flour, and then bake it and turn it into bread, right? So there are these steps. We have to eat the products of culture from now on, right? I think I'm out of time. So again, this is what it means to be human, to have culture. We don't live as natural beings, naked, eating things raw. We have to work for our food, no longer hunters and gatherers. We have to practice agriculture. We have to cook our food and eat it, not knowing whether we will have enough rain to sustain ourselves. So I'll stop there and see if there are questions.
Okay, if you're online, please raise your hand electronically. Sorry, if you're online, please raise your hand electronically. Otherwise, if you're in the audience here at OCAMIC, please raise your hand if you have any questions. First question goes to Izzy. Go ahead, unmute.
If we make the assumption that this was written by people to obtain certain objectives at the time, how would the story change if it was written today by with people of the same objectives?
I don't think I know how to answer that question. Yeah, that's an interesting question, but I have no idea how somebody would do this today, you know. Yeah, the only thing I kind of watch a certain amount of science fiction, and the only thing that comes to mind are, you know, in Star Trek, for instance, there is always a character who's not human. Spock, Data. And so in that sense, the writers are also asking about the human condition. They are curious about what it means to be human, and they do that by imagining a character who is not human and who is observes human behavior quizzically, surprise, disbelief. So to me, that's one way where in contemporary fiction, writers explore the human condition. Why, you know, but obviously they're talking about different issues, you know, humans, emotions, and so forth, through the eyes of Spock and Mr. Data, so forth. That's the best I can come up with.
Great. In the audience here at OCAMIC? Okay, there's a couple comments in the chat from Len. Thank you for an interesting analysis and lecture. I learned Hebrew and the Bible at a yeshiva, but now I don't think humans are alone in having curiosity, social learning and culture, or even a moral compass. Rhesus monkeys, for example, have been shown to not give electric shocks to other monkeys, even when it meant they would receive less food. Unfortunately, thinking humans are uniquely like God or superior is too often taken as a basis for treating other living things with less respect and fewer rights. I don't think we're better, thus more important than other animals, just different. But thinking that we are has enabled mankind to turn a blind eye to its own behavior that has even led to mass extinctions. Your comments, Dr. Kawashima?
Well, yeah, I mean, the writer of Genesis 2 and 3 saw a distinction, right? But I agree that the ethical decisions that follow from that, are far from clear, right? So there is a sense where, and I don't think the Bible, I mean, I can't disagree with what you're saying, because obviously we're killing off entire species and so forth, right? But these are eventualities that the writer could not have imagined, right? Because in this ancient world, there's no technology, and so these biblical people were carnivores, but they didn't have factories and fast food and industrial meat. So, killing a cow that you raised yourself would be a very different transaction than going to McDonald's. So I think they had a very different sense of what the animals were and the relationship between human civilization and the animal world, right? So thank you.
I have a comment or question. So I'm speaking from a secular humanist perspective, but it seems to me that your analysis of these biblical readings is an important one and makes a lot of sense. But what relevance is it really to those of us who are looking to understand knowledge and belief from a current day perspective?
Yeah, so I mean, it's not directly relevant, but I just think it's interesting to note that to begin this series, the Bible isn't against knowledge. I think knowledge is a good thing in this story. And so that's why I take the trouble of trying to convince my students that this isn't about the original sin, or that, this writer did not think that humans were supposed to be naked and ignorant, right? It's really a story about growing up and becoming adults. So I think this misreading implies that the Bible is against knowledge and that humans are supposed to be ignorant. We're not supposed to learn about these things. So I just think it's good to recall that, in fact, this biblical tradition is not against knowledge. It embraces it as that which makes us human.
I think we also have another comment from Len. Also, enmity between you and the woman implies it's not so much blaming the snake for being bad, but the woman seducing the man to eat the apple.
Yeah, I don't even think it's blaming the snake. It's I don't think it's about blame, personally. And note, there's no seduction, right? She takes from the fruit, eats of it, gives something to her man, her husband, who also eats of it. That's not seduction. And the snake did not trick her either. the snake told the truth, right? You will not die. Your eyes will be opened. In a sense, and God confirms what he said. Look, the humans have become like one of us, knowing good and evil. So the serpent said the truth. What he predicted came to pass. I'm tempted to say that, in a sense, God lied. He threatened them with death. In the day they eat of it, you will surely die. And the serpent declares that to be a falsehood, and it turns out that he's correct. I think God sort of put this threat out there and see what would happen, but they didn't die. So
Great. Any other comments online or here at OCAMIC? Questions? Well, thank you so much, Dr. Kawashima. We really appreciate your analysis, which I think was just fascinating. And it added a lot to our understanding of modern day conceptions of knowledge. So thank you so much. I know that you're on the West Coast right now, but it feels like you're with us today.
thanks. Bye-bye.